Welcome everyone to they always do that. Welcome all to our systematic review and meta-analysis SIG online seminar series. I'm James Pustiowski. I'm the SIG chair, and this will be our last seminar of the semester. But I promise you it'll be good. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce Emma Hart, who is a doctoral candidate at Columbia Teachers College in their developmental psych program. I connected with Emma, I guess maybe not quite a year ago, and learned about this very interesting work that she's doing, looking at fade-out effects and really pushing the use of meta-analysis to test questions in developmental theory. And I thought there'd be a lot of interest in having her share her work as part of the seminar, and we're really pleased that she can join us today. We'll follow our usual ground rules, so please feel free to drop questions or thoughts in the chat during her presentation, and we'll monitor the chat and interrupt if it seems appropriate. Otherwise, we'll use that as the sort of seeds for questions and discussion at the end of her presentation. So with that, please join me in welcoming Emma Hart.
Thank you so much, James, and really happy to be here and really looking forward to everyone's thoughts and feedback on this work. So let me just make sure. Can you guys see that okay? Okay, great. Awesome. So yes, I'm thrilled to be here today presenting work on MERF, the meta-analysis of educational RCTs with follow-up. And before I dive in, I just wanted to highlight two people who have been really critical to this work. One is my advisor, Tyler Watts, and the second is our collaborator, Drew Bailey. We've been working on this project for about almost 4 years now, so it's been a really long time coming and very much a strong collaboration. Also just want to highlight the many research assistants who have contributed to this work as well and have really made it possible. So with that, I'll go ahead and get into some theory and motivation for this work. So researchers and policymakers often anticipate that educational interventions will improve child outcomes at the end of interventions, set children on desirable trajectories, and ultimately have long-term impacts on important outcomes. And these expectations are really informed by a few different kind of strands of evidence and theory. On the theory side, there's a lot of strong developmental theories in kind of skill-specific domains and more general theories that all kind of suggest that rudimentary skills lay the foundation for more advanced skills. And I think this is a pretty intuitive idea. And researchers kind of theorize that this happens through kind of developmental cascades or self and cross productivities, where stronger earlier skills kind of self-reinforce and reinforce in combination with other skills, ultimately giving rise to stronger skills in the long term. And this is kind of the skills beget skills idea that many of you might be familiar with from economics as well. And there is certainly a lot of correlational evidence to support this idea. So in developmental psychology, there's lots of work showing strong autoregressive associations between earlier skills and later skills within the same domain and also across domains. So for example, lots of work showing that stronger math skills, for example, in early childhood are predictive of later math skills, and also functioning in other adult domains like earnings and educational attainment. And kind of together with this theory, this correlational evidence is often interpreted to suggest that stronger earlier skills beget stronger later skills with long run benefits on adult outcomes. And there is definitely some experimental evidence that also kind of supports this idea and this interpretation. And there's a few very highly influential kind of standout RCTs that have really made an impact on the field and the way we think about things. So from the area of early education research, the abecedarian and peri-preschool programs, for example, showed that experimentally changing children's early environments and experiences through interventions can have long-term impacts on adult outcomes, and theorized to happen through these kind of persistent effects on child skills in the intermediary period. And so kind of considering these three pieces of theory and evidence together, we can create a very plausible picture of development where stronger earlier skills lead to stronger later skills. And in application to interventions, this kind of translates into the expectation that intervention-driven boosts to child skills, so experimentally impacting child skills in the short term, should lead to kind of persistent effects on those skills over time, and also transfer to functioning in other domains and even functioning on adult outcomes that we really care about. And so just to kind of give a visual for this kind of expectation, here I have time on the x-axis and achievement on the y-axis. And if we were to imagine some intervention here where kids are randomized to the treatment group and control group, and achievement is measured at post-test, this theory and kind of expectation would lead us to expect that the standardized difference between these two groups remains pretty stable, or maybe even grows in the time following an intervention. However, in reality, I think there are kind of two very interesting and perplexing patterns that have kind of come forth in the literature that don't really follow these expectations. And the first is this phenomena of fade out, and the second is a phenomena we call emergence. And so fade out essentially is the phenomena that intervention effects on cognitive skills at post-test tend to fade in the months and years following intervention end. And this has been mostly kind of observed and studied on cognitive skill impacts of interventions. And that would look something like what I have in this figure here, where the difference between the treatment and control group is actually smaller at follow-up and reduces over time. And emergence is a maybe even more perplexing phenomena where there have been several kind of causally relevant experimental and quasi-experimental evaluations that have found long-run emergent or sleeper impacts on adult outcomes, despite fade out on cognitive skills in the short and medium term. And so these kind of two phenomena together are pretty complicated to square with existing developmental theory and raise a lot of questions. Two of which I'll be trying to kind of get into today are how broad of an issue is fade out? Maybe it's the case that fade out is less of a problem for certain skills or interventions. And the second is, what are the mechanisms through which long-run adult impacts emerge, if not through sustained benefits on child skills? And so one theory that I think is relevant to answering both of these questions is the idea that maybe interventions are generating persistent impacts on social emotional skills that explain these emergent long-term effects. And to date, really less is known about social emotional skill fade out. Like I said, most research has focused on cognitive skill fade out. And there could be good theoretical reason to expect that social emotional skills could show more persistent effects. Maybe boosting social emotional skills kind of initiates these uniquely effective skills beget skills processes that lead to more persistence. And so that leads us to kind of the first specific question I'll be addressing today, which is, do intervention impacts on social emotional skills show more persistence than impacts on cognitive skills? A second kind of theory or idea that's been out there is that maybe there are some kinds of interventions that have certain features that lend themselves to more persistent effects. So maybe there's some kinds of interventions that kind of affect kids at a deeper or more trait-like level, and so we see more persistence. So this could be interventions that maybe target younger children who are kind of thought to be more developmentally plastic and primed to respond to an intervention. Could be longer interventions or more intense interventions, those targeting not just kids, but also parents. interventions that target a range of skills instead of just one skill narrowly, and maybe interventions that occur under worse counterfactual conditions where kids are kind of standing the most to gain. And so that leads us to the second question that I'll be addressing today, which is, are there certain kinds of interventions that show greater persistence? And so to do this, I think we're at a moment in time where meta-science is really kind of desperately needed in this area of research. So most investigation of these issues to date has really kind of functioned at the within study level. So, researchers often collect impacts on a range of different skills after an educational intervention. And so sometimes you'll see more persistence on particular skills, or maybe even an intervention that generally shows more persistent effects. But most of the explanations for why this is are pretty post hoc, and I think really run the risk of kind of an under or over learning about development from any one study. And so I think with meta-analysis, we can more systematically understand how broad is this issue of fade out, and also answer really important questions about theory. So do we see across a wide range of interventions that boost a range of different child skills, that changing children's early skills experimentally, so having causal impacts on early child skills, can change children's developmental trajectories, which would be consistent with persistent intervention effects. And so that is what we've tried to accomplish and look into through our meta-analysis of educational RCTs with follow-up. We call this MERF. I'll just go ahead and get into how we created this data set. So we started with 8 published meta-analyses on a range of different kinds of educational interventions. So this was everything from infant home visiting programs to pre-K programs, elementary level curriculum, even some adolescent interventions like substance use prevention programs. And we screened all of these to only include RCTs that measured cognitive or social emotional outcomes after the intervention ended. And we had a very broad definition of what counted as cognitive and social emotional, as you can see here. And then we did a very intensive and extensive search to gather all of the papers reporting impacts on these RCTs. And then we only included those papers that had follow-up measured on the same students at least 6 months after the intervention ended. And so this led us to 85 RCTs that had usable effect sizes. We double coded all of these and all of the papers reporting impacts on these 85 RCTs. And this left us with about 726 post-test effects and about 247 follow-up effects that we were then able to analyze. So we then had to figure out a way to group this data so that we could really look at kind of isolated trajectories of intervention impacts on the same skills measured over time. And so the way that we did this is we found instances within our data set where within the same study, the same construct was measured consistently using the same measure, subscale, reporter at post-test and at least one follow-up assessment. And so we think that this approach, it's a little bit of a conservative approach for sure, but we think it has some pretty major advantages because we get a very clear definition of what we're talking about when we talk about persistence and fade out. And you could imagine many, many reasons why researchers might choose to measure different skills over time across different follow-ups and use different measures over time. And some of those are probably very, make a lot of sense, like changing a measure over time so that it's developmentally appropriate, for example. But you could also imagine a lot of selection related issues that inform these decisions. So researchers might choose to follow up skills that found very promising effects at post-test or to change measures when they don't see a promising effect. We also think that this kind of grouping approach allows us to really focus on measures that researchers cared enough about to measure multiple times. So it's very challenging kind of when you're coding these papers up to determine if a particular skill is one that researchers thought they would have impacts on, or if it was more of a secondary skill of interest. And so the fact that these skills are measured consistently over time makes us pretty confident that researchers thought their intervention would impact it. And so with this grouping approach, we got to about 460 post-test effects linked with 580 follow-up effects. And those came from 68 RCTs. And within that, there were 85 treatment control contrasts that we kind of think of as interventions and analyze in our study. So just to give an example of this, if this were all of the effects that we coded for a particular intervention, this first set would constitute kind of one analytic group. So we have externalizing problems measured at post-test and follow-up using the same measure over time. And this measure of depressive symptoms wouldn't count because we don't have follow-up. And then this set of vocabulary measures also wouldn't count because the measure changed over time. So together, these aligned groups were about 50% social emotional outcomes and about 50% cognitive outcomes, and came from largely interventions targeting just social emotional skills or just cognitive skills, although there was about 12% of interventions that targeted both skills. Okay. So first, I'm just going to give you a very descriptive sense of what these effect size trajectories looked like over time for aligned groups. So here you can see on the x-axis, this is time since post-test. So we have post-test here, 6 to 12-month follow-up, and so on. And on the y-axis are effect sizes and standard units. The darker coordinates and the larger coordinates are more precisely estimated effects. And the blue line here is the meta-analytic average at each of these time points with weights by 1 over the standard error squared. And so you can see here that on average, there was a post-test effect of about 0.29 standard deviations that fell to 0.21 standard deviations at 6 to 12-month follow-up, to 0.09 standard deviations at 1 to 2 years follow-up, and then bounced around a small effect that was pretty imprecisely estimated at these further out follow-up points. And so we think that there are probably a lot of issues related to bias in these follow-up points. So obviously there's fewer observations here that contribute to our averages. There's also a lot of bias in what is measured and reported, especially at these further out follow-ups. So the post-test impact on skills followed up, for example, greater than 4 years after intervention end, is much higher than the average post-test impact. And so for that reason, we really focus in on the 6 to 12 month and 1 to 2 year follow-up time points. I will note, and I'm happy to talk about this more after the talk if people are interested, we did see some selection, as we would expect, into what outcomes researchers followed up on consistently over time. So the meta-analytic average for the full sample prior to this aligned grouping was 0.2 standard deviations, and here it's 0.29. So we do see some selection into following up on more promising, larger post-test impacts. You will see here there's some kind of large and negative straggling effects. If we kind of condense this down to show the average of the aligned groups by study, everything kind of merges in here closer to 0. Okay, so this is a great way to get kind of a descriptive sense of what's going on here, but to really test the theory about to what extent post-test changes in child skills persist over time, we really need to look within the trajectories of aligned groups. And so the way that we did this is actually a pretty simple regression model where we are regressing the follow-up effect size on a particular aligned group on the post-test effect size. So this is all post-test effects that have an aligned follow-up, and we're looking at the extent to which those predict follow-up effects. And so to make this really clear here, if we were to imagine some hypothetical cases here with post-test effect size on the x-axis and follow-up effect size on the y-axis, if we were to observe a slope of 1 that would suggest that post-test effect sizes are perfectly predictive of follow-up effect sizes. So follow-up effects are fully mediated by the post-test effect observed on that same exact skill, and we're seeing no fade out, 100% persistence. We could also imagine the opposite, where again, we are seeing here an intercept of 0, and here's a slope of 0 as well, which suggests that knowing anything about the post-test effect size is not helpful in predicting the follow-up effect size. There's no association here. That would be 0% persistence. We could also imagine something more in the middle, so a 50% persistence right here, which would suggest a post-test effect of 1 standard deviation predicts a follow-up effect of 0.5 standard deviations. And in all of these cases, we have an intercept of 0, but we could also imagine cases where you might see a positive intercept, right? So this would suggest right here that the intervention is having impacts at follow-up that are not fully mediated by the post-test impacts on that same skill earlier on. And so this would suggest that there's something about the intervention that is predicting follow-up effects that we can't explain by the post-test effect on that same skill. And you could also imagine the opposite, which I think is definitely a less likely case, but we do see some examples of this in the literature where there might be negative unmeasured mediators as well. So you could have a positive post-test effect that then predicts a negative follow-up effect. So we're really interested to fully understand fade out and persistence. We're really interested in both the intercept and the slope. I think theoretically, the slope term is particularly interesting to us because it tells us, kind of conditional on the post-test effect that was observed, how much persistence do we predict at follow-up? And so going back to kind of our first research question, which was, do social emotional impacts persist more than cognitive impacts? The way that we tested with this was to essentially add a dummy variable for whether each skill in our sample was social, emotional, or cognitive, and then the interaction between the post-test effect on that skill and that dummy variable. And so we're really interested in this interaction term, which would tell us whether post-test effects on social emotional skills are more predictive of follow-up effects on social emotional skills compared to cognitive skills. And these models were estimated in R using metaphor, and we had random effects at the intercept level and the slope level. We had weights by 1 over the standard error squared, and we also used cluster robust standard errors. Okay, so to go ahead, I guess, are there any questions in the chat? I haven't been checking. Doesn't look like it, right? I guess I'll pause for just a moment. Does anyone have any questions before we get into the results? Okay, great. So to go ahead and jump in here. So I'm going to show you some figures here that are now include our data. So you can see post-test effects on the x-axis and follow-up effects on the y-axis. I'm first going to show you follow-up effects at 6 to 12 month follow-up, and then I'll show you effects at 1 to 2 years follow-up. And each coordinate here is one analytic group, one aligned group. The yellow coordinates are social emotional outcomes, and the blue are cognitive. The bigger coordinates are more precisely estimated. And this line here is kind of a theoretical line showing what it would look like if we had a slope of 0 and, or sorry, a slope of 1 and an intercept of 0, so 100% persistence. Here's what we found. So overall, across all outcomes, we found an intercept effect of 0.07 and a slope of 0.45. So together, this would suggest that if we observed a post-test effect of 1 standard deviation, we would expect to find a follow-up effect of about 0.5 standard deviations. And we see here that post-test is highly predictive of follow-up effects, but only persisting conditional on post-test at a rate of about 45%. And very interestingly, this looked very similar for both cognitive and social emotional skills. So there were no statistically significant differences here in the intercept or the slope. And interestingly, considering all these things in the model together, so post-test and the skill type, we still saw pretty meaningful heterogeneity both in the slope and in the intercept across studies. So it seems that post-test is it's predictive of follow-up effects, but there's still a lot of heterogeneity that's unexplained. So moving on to the 1 to 2 year follow-up period. So you'll immediately see that we have far fewer observations here. So we really put a lot less stake in these results because they're just less precise. But we see, again, fade out and more fade out than what we saw at 6 to 12 month follow-up. So a slope overall of 0.18 and a very small intercept effect. Neither is precisely estimated. And when we look at this separately for cognitive versus social emotional skills, we do see some differences. They're not statistically significant because of these precision issues. But if anything, we see greater persistence, conditional persistence for cognitive outcomes compared to social emotional outcomes. And again, we do see pretty considerable heterogeneity in the slope across studies. So we ran lots of different robustness checks, which I'm happy to get into, but I think the 3 most important ones, we ran model with study fixed effects. We also ran a correlated and hierarchical model. We also ran models that controlled for other intervention characteristics. And across all of these, we found very similar findings. So to kind of conclude on that first analysis, it seems that social emotional skills and cognitive skills fade out somewhat similarly, and it does not appear that social emotional skills are maybe that one single missing link that explains long-run emergent effects despite cognitive skill fade out. From the slope term, we learned that post-test impacts are meaningfully predictive of follow-up effects, and we're seeing a conditional persistence rate of about 45%. So if you find a post-test effect of anything and multiply it by 0.45, that is what our model would predict your follow-up effect is going to be at 6 to 12 months follow-up. Our intercept was also interesting. It suggested there's a small portion of follow-up effects that's unexplained by post-test effects. This is actually somewhat interesting and meaningful when post-test effects are smaller, because that intercept, 0.07 intercept, is actually proportionally can be a large portion of a small post-test effect. And so we can see greater absolute persistence in the case of small post-test effects. And I'm happy to talk about that more too in the discussion. All right, so moving on to the second question, which is, do kind of theoretically salient intervention features predict greater persistence? So we don't see that skill type seems to be this like magic missing ingredient, but maybe there's some intervention characteristics, some kinds of interventions that find greater persistence. So we looked at a lot of different factors. For this talk, I'm going to focus on these ones. So we looked at whether the intervention targeted younger children versus older children, the length of the intervention, whether parents were targeted, whether the intervention targeted both cognitive and social emotional skills. That's what we're referring to as broad versus more narrow, so just cognitive or just social emotional skills, and whether the intervention occurred under worse counterfactual conditions. And we define this as the intervention taking place pre-2000. So kind of thinking about time of the intervention as a rough metric for kind of the general state of things, social safety supports and things like that. And so as the kind of same approach as we used for the cognitive versus social emotional question, we're just entering a dummy variable for each intervention feature one by one, and then the interaction between that feature and the post-test effect. So this table is a little bit overwhelming, but what I'm showing you here is each of the moderators, the constant for each kind of split of the moderator and the slope terms. The important thing is that we really don't find very many differences here. So for ECE interventions, we actually find the opposite of what most theory would expect. So we see greater conditional persistence at 6 to 12 months follow-up for non-ECE studies, so interventions targeting older children. But even then, we're still seeing a conditional persistence rate of 0.56. So there's still a good bit of fade out happening there. For interventions targeting a broader set of skills, we also see a slight difference, or we see a difference here where interventions actually targeting more narrow set of skills seem to have greater conditional persistence. At 1 to 2 years follow-up, this all kind of washes out. So for ECE, we see that the direction of the difference flips. For broad versus narrow interventions, we see no difference, and we don't see any action on the other moderators. And across the other moderators we looked at as well, we also saw no differences in persistence. So our takeaway from this kind of set of analyses is that it does not really appear that there's one broad class of interventions for which fade out is not an issue. Like, we're really seeing this conditional fade out issue across different kinds of interventions. So to go ahead and wrap this up and kind of draw some conclusions here. So we do see evidence of fade out across a broad range of RCTs. And we don't see evidence that fade out looks substantially different for social, emotional versus cognitive skills. At least, the important caveat, at least within the first few years after post-test that we were really powered to investigate. And so to note a few limitations here, related to that, we really did have limited power to precisely estimate trajectories of fade out for follow-up assessments greater than 2 years after post-test. And I think this is a clear reflection of issues in funding long-term intervention evaluations. And we also, can't really do anything about the fact that there probably are issues related to selection bias. Researchers choosing what skills to follow up on using the same consistent measure over time. In terms of implications, it does not appear that we can confidently predict a priori which kinds of skills or interventions are going to show the greatest persistence. And so taking this together, it could be that two things are true, that we can find fade out on insular skills measured consistently over time, and also long run emergent effects on adult outcomes. And the big question then is, like, how could this be? It really doesn't follow with our current developmental theories. So it seems that the dynamics are probably just much more complicated than one is expected based on kind of this plausible picture of development I shared with you earlier. So it doesn't seem that just boosting child skills necessarily changes developmental trajectories in a way that's consistent with persistent effects on that same skill. And so it could be that interventions find these emergent long-run effects through much more complicated networks of skills and child environments and relationships, where you could imagine that a post-test impact could have kind of transfer effects to other skills, and we might observe fade out on that post-test impact, but there's kind of rippling effects out on other skills and aspects of children's lives that ultimately affect their long-run outcomes. These are questions that we're really interested in and planning to, that's where we're going next. So we're currently actually expanding our MERF data set to include all possible RCTs that have long run impacts on adult outcomes that we've been able to find through a systematic search. And our big question with that data set is, if sustained skill impacts are not a necessary condition for long run effects, is there any information that we can use to forecast which interventions are likely to have long run effects? And we think has obvious practical implications for policymakers, but also really important theoretical implications. And so specifically, we're most interested in, do post-test impacts forecast long run intervention effects despite fade out in the intermediary period? And so I'll end there, and really excited to hear people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. We have lots of time for questions and discussions. So please feel free to put questions into the chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we can call on you and Don't be shy, folks. So I guess I'll try to get us warmed up. The right forecasting adult outcomes sounds like a very promising direction, but it seems like selective reporting could also be a major issue there, right? Like that. So because right, like you won't like right, it's possible that we only pay attention to stuff that is right surprising, right? Or people are only going to write up findings on adult outcomes if they're counterintuitive, or big enough that to be kind of shocking. Do you have any purchase on that, or do you have anything that you can do to protect yourself against that possibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that is a huge concern that I don't know that I don't think we'll be able to fully get around, because we can only really look at these things in studies that have measured long run follow-ups. And I think Drew and Tyler have done a lot of work around suggesting the importance of just following up as many RCT evaluations of educational programs as possible so we can avoid these issues. I will say the one thing we're trying to do, like I kind of mentioned, is really do a systematic sweep to gather all of the interventions that have long run follow-up. So even though that's probably a highly selected sample, it's better than just focusing on the studies that are really famously known for having really surprising long run effects, like Abecedarian and Perry. So we are pulling in lots of interventions that I had really never heard about. So that's good. But I think aside from that, I don't know that there's too much we can do. We can compare, I guess, the post and short-term impacts of the interventions that end up in our sample to our larger MERF sample as well, to try to see how big of differences there are in kind of the post-test impacts of and short-term impacts of the interventions that do really long-term follow-up. But yeah, I think short of just randomly or systematically doing follow-up on all interventions, we can't totally get around this problem.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think there's some, if one approach that we'll probably look at, I don't know how optimistic we should be that it's going to solve things, is, there are probably some imputation things that can be done once we get enough impacts from studies that have followed up, and we can look at the relationship to their post-test effects. And then, like Emma's saying, we can compare those to the post-test effects that don't have any follow-up, and then try to see if we can kind of project what the likely follow-up effects may have been. Drew, I think, who is on the call, did that a little bit with some work MDRC had on college RCTs, like college advising RCTs. But you end up kind of assuming that the post-test to follow-up impact relationship is consistent and the same for all of these impacts that you haven't observed, right? And so that's, who knows, right? If that's right or not, but I'm sure we'll do some of those types of analyses. It's a quiet group.
Yeah, maybe we need to look at like fade out effect or end of semester effects. Oh, question from Johanna.
Hi there. This was so great. Thank you for doing such amazing work. That's really so important. And I love seeing this and really enjoyed your presentation. I would be so curious, given all of the future directions that you might pursue, I focus on reading. And so I am very curious if there are developmental periods of time that some skills are more amenable to big swings in movements. And reading is one of them, depending on which aspect of reading you cover. So my very selfish wish is that among this data set that you have, and we could talk more about this later, I would be so excited to see if you were able to look at this by very specific constructs. I believe you mentioned for the second research question that you did include in your model intervention specific conditions, but I can't remember if construct was one of them. And I can't remember if something like reading was singular in some way for your analysis. But reading and or other dimensions may just have developmental periods where their growth potential, either because that's what's focused on in school explicitly, or for other reasons just have movement. So I wonder if you're kind of thinking about aligning the trajectories with the kinds of skills and potential differences in those skills in your model.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So obviously I showed you the cognitive versus social emotional more broadly. I will say, actually, the vast majority, I think about 80% of the cognitive impacts in our sample are language and literacy outcomes, which is kind of an interesting feature of our data set. So we don't see differences by skill at that level. And then if anything, we see slightly greater fade out for early childhood education interventions generally, but we haven't run kind of like the three-way interaction between post-test effects by skill type, by developmental period. I'm not sure that we'd have the power to do that, but I agree it's really interesting. We do have lots of different specific constructs measured within the realm of language and literacy, so could definitely be something we talk about. And it would be interesting to see. I'm just not sure how much power we would have at the end of the day to like really nail that down.
Within the language and literacy outcomes, we have another student right now who's been working on this construct that's been kind of popular in early childhood education research recently. It's like the skill is sort of constrained or unconstrained. So that's this idea that certain skills kind of have natural ceilings, and other skills you could have sort of longer term growth potential. We thought, oh, well, we've got all these, and that had originally been kind of developed in the reading literature, that idea. And so we have tried to apply that to this data set, and there were a lot of interesting insights from that. I mean, one is just the construct of putting skills in these different bins was actually difficult to do. Once we look at how they're actually operationalized, figuring out most of the measures we have in our data set really don't have clear ceilings, but we have been analyzing that and looking into that, and we could talk about what we're seeing there if you're interested. But yeah, Emma certainly, like, they coded for whatever this construct is that the researcher called the measure. So there could be a lot more work on that, but I agree with Emma that we might end up, like with really, really small cell sizes.
If there's some specific skill or developmental period you're like super interested in, we could look and see how much we have. But sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh yes, no, thank you so much. I will definitely be glad to follow up. And I guess maybe the one other dimension I'm curious about is bringing the focus back to the interface between who the population is and what the curriculum is. I also focus on kids with reading disabilities, and I would be so curious if there was some way to pull apart whether the programming was tailored toward kids with reading difficulties, or if it was more generally aimed toward populations that are not experiencing vulnerabilities, and if there are differences from that perspective.
Yeah, and we did code for whether the intervention was kind of targeting students that were struggling in whatever, domain the intervention was focused on. We haven't broken it down, like looking just within reading or cognitive skills, for example, at whether there's differences. But I will say in the full sample, we don't see any differences in conditional persistence or the intercepts in terms of whether the intervention was targeting students who were struggling versus not. But like I said, yeah, we haven't looked within just reading or social emotional. So it's possible that it's different there.
Well, as you can see, I'm very excited and there's so many questions, but I'll pause here and just really appreciate what you've shared. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will also just add, we're planning to publicly release this data set for people to use. So this could totally also, if you have like very specific questions, you could totally investigate them in the data when we post it as well.
Michael, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, James. When I look back at all the things that people, all the skills that people tried to teach me in my education, and look at which of them I can now do, it strikes me that there are two important features. One of which I don't think you can do very much about is whether I've actually carried on practicing and using that skill over my adult life. Because there are some things that I was actually quite good at age 16, which I couldn't do now. But the other thing is there's just the sheer intensity of those interventions. So I wonder if you could say something about how intense a typical intervention is in one of these randomized trials. I'm not an education researcher, by the way, which is why I'm so completely ignorant of what you guys do. I work in health.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we really did have a broad range of different levels of intensity. So there were some interventions that were relatively brief, less than a school year. And then there were some interventions that were multi-year and like everyday pre-K or childcare for multiple years. And so it was a big range. And I'm looking real quick just to double check, but I think, let's see. So when we ran our analysis, splitting the interventions by whether they were longer or shorter as kind of a measure of intensity, the longer interventions on average were about 11 months and the shorter interventions were about 3 months. So if that gives you kind of a good sense that I think most of the interventions were about a school year. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else about that. I think one thing that's interesting about our model is that because we're estimating follow-up effects conditional on post-test effects, we think that post-test impact kind of captures the effects of longer or shorter interventions, like factors like intensity are kind of bundled into the size of the post-test effect. But yeah, we didn't really see systematic differences based on intensity. And it had a real big range in our sample.
Thank you.
Yeah. We did also code, I will just say one other thing, we did try to get to the level of coding, like how many hours the kids were in the intervention. And that just got pretty messy and a lot of missing data because it's not always clearly reported. So we focused on kind of months, but yeah.
Wolfgang.
Yes, hi. Thanks for this very interesting presentation. The one part that I'm especially interested in is a statistical one, namely this idea of trying to predict one effect size from another effect size, right? So in your case, the post-treatment and then the follow-up, there's quite a bit of literature on this, especially in the medical field, where people are talking about surrogacy. So you see things like in oncology, you have effect sizes for like disease-free survival and trying to use that to predict overall survival later on. So there's quite a bit of literature on this that I think is worth looking into when doing this kind of predicting of one effect size from the other, because one of the issues here is that when you're using the one effect size, the post-treatment effect size, as a predictor, you're sort of treating it as if it is free of any kind of measurement error. right? So this quite relates to also just in regression modeling, when you have a predictor that is measured actually with error and you ignore this, you get typically attenuation effects. So actually the predictive power might be actually higher than you're currently estimating it to be if you take that into consideration. So this is not really a question, sorry. I'm one of these people with not a question, more of a comment. But anyway, it just occurred to me that this is something that you might want to take a look at and consider some alternative options for modeling this kind of relationship.
Yeah, thank you. And that is something we have thought about. I think on the one hand, if like error is correlated over time, that's one issue. And then if error is random over time, that's a kind of issue. And the ways in which that would bias our estimates are maybe kind of opposing. And but yeah, that's definitely a limitation of our current model. And yeah, I'll be interested to look into the medical literature you mentioned. That's really interesting. I don't know if Drew or Tyler, if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great. It'd be great to work with someone on this who could help us kind of think through all the issues here, because yeah, like none of the measures that we have are measured without, or the impact estimates in our data are derived from measures that are measured with error. And probably it's the case that the social emotional measures have lower reliability than a lot of the cognitive measures do. So there's kind of that issue lurking. So knowing how measurement error affects on average, we could expect that to affect the impact estimates that are coming out of these studies would be kind of the first question I would have. And then there's how to address that in the meta regression model is kind of the next thing. So that's, yeah, it's kind of a bunch of complications there, but we've thought about it, but I don't think we've come up with a great process for dealing with it.
Yeah, Wolfgang, like the surrogacy models, are those, people use like a multivariate specification?
That's one approach, right? So you use both effect sizes as an outcome because they are really outcomes, but they are of course correlated outcomes, which then gets you into the tricky thing of having some kind of estimate of how these effect sizes or the sampling errors of these effect sizes are correlated, which tricky because basically need to know something about how the dependent variable is correlated over time in these samples. But there might be some information out there to sort of guesstimate this. I mean, it's the same problem that arises in any kind of multivariate type of situation where you need these kind of correlations between the effect sizes. So that's one approach, a multivariate approach. There are some other sort of methods out there. Actually, I was recently involved in a project where we are working with this so-called Daniel and Hughes model. So Daniel and Hughes have a sort of famous paper on how to model surrogacy. And it's sort of, I think that's kind of a popular model. So that could be something to look into. So yeah, there are a couple of different approaches out there. Quite a number of them use sort of a Bayesian approach, although that was actually sort of the recent work that we did where we are taking the Daniel and Hughes model and putting it into a more frequentist or likelihood framework. If you're at SRSM, you will hear at least one presentation about this. So Dan Jackson and I and a couple other people, we were working on this. So
great.
So with any of these, though, we need to have good information about the correlation in the outcomes over time, right? So say the correlation outcomes at post-test and outcomes at follow-up. My understanding is that like so if you use that approach, then the central focus is really on the covariance between post-test and follow-up. But those covariance parameter estimates, I think, are quite sensitive to your assumption about the correlation between outcomes. So if you don't have good information about that, you very different things.
Not actually, not so sure about this, to what extent this has a huge impact. I think for the data sets that we played around with, we did some sensitivity analysis, and it doesn't end up like having as you would think, like it would have a huge impact, but a lot of the information about like is really just the effect sizes themselves. So how you assume the sampling errors are correlated ends up not having as huge of an impact on the slope for that you are estimating in the end after all. Which you would think it would have a huge impact, but not. I mean, okay, yeah, if you really take extremes, right, like 0 versus 0.99, okay, then you might see rather different results. But if you're sort of within a reasonable range, I think the impact might actually not be as great as one might suspect initially. But I mean, this is to be tried out. So if you make this data set available, of course, that still leaves the issue of having to guesstimate these correlations. But well, that's a common problem. But then one can at least do sensitivity analyses and actually explore how much results would change when you use a multivariate model or the standard use model and see what happens. And who knows, maybe the results would be quite similar to what you're doing right now. But I think this would be worth looking into.
Great. Thank you.
Say, as your bartender, last call for questions. I know it's the end of the semester and we're talking about correlated measurement errors. So maybe we should call it a day. But Emma, thank you so much for sharing this work with us. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you all for joining us. This is the last seminar of spring semester, but we will be back in the fall for at least one more round of this. I'll be working on the schedule this coming summer. So if you have suggestions, requests, like wish lists, or if you're interested in nominating yourself or nominating a friend to get back at them, please do reach out to me. I would love to have your input on the future lineup for the seminar. Okay, with that, thank you all. Have a great spring, summer, whatever season you're in right now.